The sun cast long shadows over the drought-stricken plains of Promise Creek, Arizona Territory, as Willa Barrett knelt at her small kitchen table, head bowed over 3 empty plates, her hollow prayer echoing through the weathered walls of her modest homestead. It was 1871, and the unforgiving western frontier had already taken everything from her husband to tuberculosis, her crops to the relentless drought, and now it seemed determined to take her dignity too. "Lord," she whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of maintaining hope, "provide for us as you see fit. Amen." She opened her eyes to meet the expectant gazes of her 2 young siblings, Timothy, aged 10, and Sarah, just 7, whom she had promised to care for after their parents passing 2 years prior. "Is supper coming soon, Willa?" Sarah asked, her small fingers tracing the pattern on the empty plate before her. Willa forced a smile. "Just a little while longer, darling. I'm preparing something special." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it was all she had to offer. The pantry held nothing but dust and memories of better days. Unbeknownst to her, Xavier Sullivan watched from just beyond the open window, his weathered hat in his hands. He had been passing through on his way north with a small herd when the sight of the young woman praying over empty plates stopped him cold. In his 30 years of life, he'd seen plenty of hardship on the frontier, but something about this scene, the quiet dignity, the desperate faith, stirred something deep within him. Xavier had come to Promise Creek following rumors of unclaimed grazing land, hoping to build something of his own after years of driving cattle for wealthier men. He hadn't planned on staying more than a night, but fate, it seemed, had other ideas. Making a swift decision, he returned to his horse, retrieved a canvas-wrapped package from his saddlebags, and approached the front door. His knock seemed to startle the occupants. Visitors were rare this far from town. Willa opened the door cautiously, her wary eyes taking in the tall stranger with sun-bronzed skin and kind eyes the color of a summer storm. "Can I help you, sir?" "Madam." Xavier removed his hat respectfully. "Name's Xavier Sullivan. I was passing by and—" He hesitated, not wanting to wound her pride. "I've got more provisions than I need for my journey. Thought perhaps you might help me by taking some off my hands." Willa's cheeks flushed with a mixture of shame and gratitude. Had he seen them at their empty table? The thought mortified her, but the rumbling in her stomach and the hollow-eyed look of her siblings made pride a luxury she couldn't afford. "That's very kind, Mr. Sullivan," she finally said, stepping back to allow him entry. "We'd be grateful for any assistance." Xavier entered, setting his bundle on the table and unwrapping it to reveal fresh venison, cornmeal, beans, and a small jar of honey, modest offerings that might as well have been gold to the hungry family. "I hunted the deer this morning," he explained, noting how the children's eyes widened at the sight of real food. "Seems a shame to let good meat go to waste." Willa stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the stranger's kindness. "I'm Willa Barrett," she finally managed. "These are my siblings, Timothy and Sarah." Xavier nodded to each in turn. "Pleasure to meet you all. Are you a real cowboy?" Timothy blurted, eyeing the man's worn leather chaps and the revolver holstered at his hip. Xavier smiled. "Suppose I am. Been working cattle since I was hardly older than you." While Willa prepared a meal with the unexpected bounty, Xavier entertained the children with tales of cattle drives and frontier adventures. She couldn't help but notice how Timothy hung on every word, or how Sarah had climbed comfortably into the stranger's lap, as if she'd known him forever. It had been so long since any of them had experienced simple kindness from another soul. Over dinner, the first real meal they'd had in days, Willa shared their story. How her husband Daniel had succumbed to consumption just 8 months after their wedding. How her parents had died in a flash flood while traveling to visit them. How the drought had withered their crops and dwindled their prospects until prayer over empty plates became their nightly ritual. "What will you do now?" Xavier asked quietly after the children had been put to bed. Willa stared into the small hearth fire. "Keep going," she said simply. "What else can I do? This land was Daniel's dream. I owe it to him to try." Xavier nodded, understanding the weight of promises made to the departed. It's admirable what you're doing for your siblings. They're all I have left, she whispered. I'd die before I'd let them go hungry, but sometimes. Her voice trailed off, the admission of failure too painful to voice. Sometimes even the strongest need help, Xavier finished for her. He hesitated, then added, I've got a small herd camped about a mile south. I was planning to keep moving north, but I reckon my cattle could use a few days' rest. If you'd allow it, I could help with some repairs around your place. Noticed your roof's got a leak or two. Willa looked up sharply. We can't pay you, not asking for payment. His voice was gentle. Just offering a hand to a neighbor. We're hardly neighbors if you're just passing through, she countered, but there was less edge to her voice now. Xavier smiled. Well then, consider it an investment in frontier hospitality. Never know when I might need someone to return the favor. Against her better judgment, Willa found herself agreeing. One day of help became two, then a week. Xavier repaired the roof, mended fences, and even managed to coax life from their struggling well. Each evening he would return to his small camp, but come morning he was back at their door, ready to tackle whatever needed doing. The children adored him. Timothy followed Xavier everywhere, eager to learn the ways of horses and cattle. Sarah collected wildflowers to present to him each morning, delighted when he tucked them into his hatband with solemn ceremony. And Willa found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice, the way his strong hands moved with surprising gentleness. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed at Timothy's jokes. The way he truly listened when she spoke, as if her words mattered. It had been so long since she'd felt seen. 2 weeks after his arrival, Xavier brought a cow and her calf to the homestead. She's good for about 2 gallons a day, he explained as Willa stared in disbelief. The calf is weaned enough to take just what she needs. The rest can help feed your family. Mr. Sullivan, I can't accept, Xavier, he corrected gently. And yes, you can. Consider her payment for your hospitality. We've hardly been hospitable. You've worked from dawn till dusk while we've had little to offer in return. You've offered plenty, he said, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Sometimes worth isn't measured in coin or goods, miss. Barrett, Willa, she said softly. If I'm to call you Xavier, then you must call me Willa. The smile that spread across his face made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't experienced since before Daniel fell ill. The realization brought immediate guilt. She turned away quickly, busying herself with the cow's lead rope. That night, after the children were asleep, Willa sat on the porch steps, staring up at the vast blanket of stars. The spring air carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Perhaps the drought was finally breaking. She sensed rather than heard Xavier approach, his boots making little sound on the packed earth. Mind if I join you? He asked, and at her nod, settled beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Daniel and I used to sit out here, she finally said, surprising herself with the admission. We'd plan our future under these stars, children, cattle, crops, such big dreams we had. They're still good dreams, Xavier said quietly. Willa shook her head. Dreams need more than one person to carry them. Is that what I've been seeing? A woman who's given up? His words stung with their accuracy. I haven't given up, she said defensively. I'm still here, aren't I? Still fighting, are you? His voice was gentle, not accusing. Or are you just existing? There's a difference, Willa. She wanted to be angry at his presumption, but the truth of his words disarmed her. It's hard to dream when you're terrified of disappointment, she whispered. Xavier nodded slowly. Fear's a natural companion out here. Question is whether you let it ride beside you or take the reins. They talked long into the night about loss and hope, about the harsh beauty of the frontier, about the future that seemed both terrifying and full of possibility. When Willa finally retired to her bed, something had shifted between them, a trust born of shared understanding. The weeks turned to a month and still Xavier remained. His herd grazed on nearby land, growing fat on spring grass. Each morning brought him to their door with fresh game or wild berries, or simply his strong hands ready for work. The homestead began to transform under his care. Vegetable seedlings pushed through the soil of the newly tended garden. The barn stood straighter with repaired beams. and a small flock of chickens now scratched in the yard, a gift from a trading expedition Xavier had made to town. Promise Creek began to live up to its name. One afternoon, Xavier taught Willa to shoot his Winchester rifle. She'd been hesitant at first. Daniel had never believed women should handle firearms, but Xavier was insistent. "Out here, self-reliance isn't a luxury, it's survival," he'd explained, positioning the rifle against her shoulder. "Stand firm like you're braced against a strong wind." She'd missed the first few shots, but the fifth had struck the makeshift target dead center. Her triumphant laugh had drawn an expression from Xavier that made her breath catch admiration mixed with something deeper, something that made her quickly turn back to the target. That evening, as they sat shelling peas on the porch while the children played nearby, Xavier finally spoke of his past. "I was orphaned young," he said, his hands never ceasing their work. "Raised mostly by trail bosses and cowhands, been moving ever since Texas, Kansas, Colorado. Never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots." "What changed?" Willa asked, somehow knowing there was more to his story. Xavier's hands stilled. 2 years back, I rode with an outfit pushing cattle to Sedona, got caught in a blizzard in the mountains, lost most of the herd. And 3 good men." His voice grew tight. "I survived because they gave me their blankets, insisted I was youngest and had to make it out." Willa reached across the space between them, covering his hand with hers. "Made me realize I'd been wasting the time they'd never get," he continued. "Started saving, building my own small herd, wanted something that would last beyond me." His eyes met hers. "Something worth staying for." The weight of his words hung between them. Willa withdrew her hand, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of the moment. "And have you found it?" "Something worth staying for." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, Timothy came running up, excited about a lizard he'd captured, and the moment passed. But that night, Willa lay awake long after the household had quieted, replaying Xavier's words in her mind, trying to ignore the hope unfurling in her chest. The following Sunday, Xavier accompanied the family to the small church in Promise Creek. It was Willa's first visit since, before the drought had grown severe, pride had kept her away, unwilling to face the community's pity. But with new clothes for the children purchased with egg money and Xavier walking beside them, she found the courage to return. The townsfolk welcomed them warmly, though Willa didn't miss the curious glances cast between her and Xavier. Mrs. Abernathy, the shopkeeper's wife and town's most notorious gossip, made a point of commenting how settled Xavier looked compared to the drifter who'd passed through town weeks earlier. "Must be the company he's keeping," she added with a meaningful look that made Willa blush to her roots. After the service, Sheriff Jackson approached them. "Sullivan," he nodded to Xavier, "word is you've got interest in the old Peterson place, 15 acres just north of the Barrett homestead." Willa turned to Xavier in surprise. This was the first she'd heard of any such plans. Xavier's expression remained neutral. "Just making inquiries, Sheriff." "Well, inquiry all you want, but that land's spoken for. Randall Stevens put money down last month. He's buying up everything he can, building some kind of cattle empire." The sheriff looked pointedly at Willa. "Been asking about your place too, Miss Barrett. Seems mighty interested in consolidating that whole northern stretch." Willa's stomach twisted. Randall Stevens was known throughout the territory as a man who got what he wanted by fair means or foul. 3 small ranchers had already sold to him after mysterious incidents: poisoned wells, burned hay, cattle found shot. "My land isn't for sale," she said firmly. The sheriff shrugged. "Might want to reconsider. Stevens doesn't take rejection well." As they walked home, Willa confronted Xavier about the Peterson land. "Were you planning to tell me you were staying in Promise Creek?" "I was waiting for the right time," he admitted. "Nothing's certain yet, but you want to stay, permanently?" Xavier stopped walking, turning to face her. The children had run ahead, chasing each other through the wildflowers that dotted the trail. "I've found reasons to put down roots," he said carefully. "If those reasons welcome it." Willa's heart hammered against her ribs. "And if Stevens has already claimed the Peterson land?" "There's other land." His eyes held her steadily. "The location matters less than what and who is nearby." Before she could formulate a response, Timothy's shout pulled their attention away. A rider was approaching their homestead in the distance, moving fast and trailing dust. They hurried the rest of the way home to find one of Stephen's ranch hands waiting, a letter in hand addressed to Willa. The message was direct, an offer for her homestead, far below its worth even in drought conditions. Mr. Stevens is prepared to be generous considering the challenges of your situation, the ranch hand said, eyeing the modest homestead with poorly concealed contempt. He's giving folks till the end of the month to decide before his final offer drops considerably. Tell Stevens the Barrett place isn't for sale. Not now, not ever, Xavier replied before Willa could speak. The man's eyes narrowed. Don't believe I was addressing you, Cowboy. Mr. Sullivan speaks with my authority, Willa said, finding her voice. My answer is the same. This land stays in my family. After the messenger departed, Willa turned to Xavier. You shouldn't have spoken for me. You're right. I'm sorry. His apology was immediate and sincere. I just couldn't stand the way he looked at you like you were helpless. I've been managing on my own for some time, Xavier. I know that better than most, he said quietly. Your strength is what? He stopped himself. What I admire about you. That night brought the first rain in months, a gentle, steady shower that continued through dawn. Willa stood on the porch watching the thirsty earth drink it in, feeling as if the sky itself was validating her decision to stay and fight. Xavier joined her, passing her a steaming cup of coffee. Good omen, he said, nodding toward the raindrops creating circles in the puddles forming in the yard. I used to love the rain, she admitted. During our first year of marriage, Daniel and I would sit right here during storms, planning all the things we'd grow. After he died, rain just reminded me of everything I'd lost. She took a sip of coffee. But today it feels like possibility again. His hand found hers in the gray morning light, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that should have been shocking but somehow wasn't. They stood that way, watching the rain together, until Sarah's voice called from inside, breaking the spell. The trouble started 3 days later. Willa woke to find 2 of their chickens dead, their necks wrung and bodies left prominently in the dooryard. Xavier examined the ground for tracks, but the night's rain had washed away any evidence. Could be coyotes, he suggested, but his tone said he believed otherwise. The next day, Timothy discovered their well had been tampered with. Someone had dropped a dead rabbit down it, fouling the water. Xavier spent hours cleaning it out while Willa rode into town to inform the sheriff. No proof it was Stevens' doing, was all the lawman would say. Could be local boys playing pranks. Then why is it only happening to those who have refused to sell to Stevens? She demanded. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Stevens brings a lot of business to this town, Miss Barrett. Without proof, my hands are tied. Willa left the sheriff's office with a bitter taste in her mouth. The law would provide no protection against whatever came next. That evening, as they discussed their options around the dinner table, a shot rang out in the darkness. The bullet splintered the window frame just inches from where Xavier sat. He immediately doused the lamp, plunging the room into darkness as another shot followed. Get down. He ordered, pulling Willa and the children to the floor. Stay low and crawl to the back room. What about you? Willa gasped, clutching Sarah to her chest as the little girl sobbed in terror. I'm going to have a conversation with our visitors, Xavier said grimly, checking his revolver. No. Willa grabbed his arm. That's what they want to provoke a fight they can claim was your fault. A third shot punctuated her words, this one thudding into the wood of the front door. We can't just hide, Xavier argued. We won't. Willa's mind raced, but we need to be smarter than them. Stevens wants this to look legitimate, like you started trouble and they defended themselves. In the darkness, she outlined her plan. It was risky, but Xavier reluctantly agreed it made more sense than charging out guns blazing. The next morning, Willa rode into town alone, straight to the telegraph office. By afternoon, she'd sent messages to every newspaper within 100 miles, detailing the harassment and intimidation tactics being used against small landowners who refused to sell to Randall Stevens. She named names, dates, incidents, everything she'd gathered from speaking with other families who'd been pressured. Her second stop was the land office, where she filed paperwork claiming Xavier Sullivan as her business partner in the Barrett homestead, giving him legal standing on the property. The clerk raised his eyebrows but processed the documents without comment. That evening, as Xavier worked to board up their damaged window, he questioned her strategy. "Stevens has powerful friends. You've made yourself a target." "I already was a target," she countered. "Now I'm a target with witnesses and public scrutiny. Stevens operates in shadows. This drags him into the light." Xavier shook his head in amazement. "You're a remarkable woman, Willa Barrett." "I'm a desperate woman," she corrected, but his admiring gaze brought warmth to her cheeks. Her gamble paid off faster than expected. 2 days later, a journalist from the Tucson Herald arrived in Promise Creek, asking questions about Stevens' land acquisitions. By week's end, a territorial official had been dispatched to investigate claims of intimidation and corruption involving the local sheriff. Stevens himself appeared at their gate the following Sunday, looking considerably less imposing up close than his reputation suggested. He was a portly man in an expensive Eastern suit that seemed out of place against the rugged landscape. "You've caused quite a stir, Miss Barrett," he said, remaining on his horse as Willa and Xavier stood side by side on their porch, Xavier's hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "I've simply shined light on your business practices, Mr. Stevens," she replied evenly. Stevens' smile didn't reach his eyes. "I came to inform you I've withdrawn my interest in your property. Seems there are less complicated acquisitions to be made elsewhere." "Glad to hear you're being sensible," Xavier said. Stevens turned his cold gaze to Xavier. "I don't forget those who cross me, Cowboy. This territory's small. Our paths will cross again." "Looking forward to it," Xavier replied with a dangerous smile of his own. As Stevens rode away, Willa released the breath she'd been holding. "Is it over?" Xavier put his arm around her shoulders. "For now, men like Stevens don't change their nature, but they do understand self-preservation. You've made yourself too costly a target." That night, they celebrated with a special dinner. The garden was yielding its first vegetables, the cow provided fresh milk, and Xavier had shot a fat turkey that morning. As they sat around the table no longer empty, but laden with the fruits of their combined efforts, Willa offered a prayer of genuine thanksgiving. Later, after the children were asleep, Xavier found Willa sitting on the porch steps, her face tilted up to the star-filled sky. "I filed the paperwork on the Peterson place today," he said without preamble. With Stevens backing off, the land agent was suddenly very accommodating. Willa's heart skipped. "So you'll be our neighbor then?" "That depends." He sat beside her, closer than usual. "The Peterson place needs a lot of work. House is barely standing, fields are overgrown, be a mighty lonely endeavor for one man." "I imagine you'd manage," she said softly, though her pulse quickened at the direction of his words. "I imagine I would," he agreed. "But I've been thinking about a different arrangement altogether." He took her hand then, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "When I first saw you, Willa Barrett, you were praying over empty plates with more dignity and faith than most possess with full bellies and easy lives. I knew then you were someone extraordinary." Willa's eyes filled with tears. "I was at my lowest moment." "No," he shook his head. "You were revealing your true character. In your darkest hour, you still had hope, still put your siblings before yourself." He paused. "I came to Promise Creek looking for land, but I found something far more valuable." "What did you find?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe the turn her life had taken. "A woman worth changing for, a family worth staying for." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "I'm not asking you to forget, Daniel. What you had deserves to be honored, but I'm asking if there might be room in your heart for a new dream, one we could build together." Tears spilled onto Willa's cheeks. "The children already gave their blessing," he said with a smile. "Asked them this morning while you were gathering eggs." "You were that confident in my answer?" she asked, arching an eyebrow despite her tears. Xavier laughed softly. "Not confident, hopeful. There's a difference." Willa looked at the ring, then at the man before her, this unexpected answer to prayers she'd been too afraid to voice. "I never thought I'd find this again," she admitted. "After Daniel died, I convinced myself that kind of love comes once if you're lucky. And now." She smiled through her tears. "Now I think perhaps God is more generous than I gave him credit for." When she kissed him, It felt like coming home and embarking on an adventure all at once, familiar and thrilling, safe and exhilarating. They married 2 weeks later in the small church in Promise Creek, with Timothy standing proudly as Xavier's best man and Sarah scattering wildflower petals along the aisle. The same townsfolk who had once looked at Willa with pity now celebrated the union of two people who had found each other against all odds. That evening, as they returned to the homestead, their homestead now, Xavier swept her into his arms at the threshold, honoring tradition despite her laughing protests. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the front room, which the children had decorated with candles and spring blooms. "I've been home all along," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "You just helped me see it again." Later, after the children had finally succumbed to sleep, excited though they were by the day's events, Xavier and Willa stood together on the porch under the vast canopy of stars that had witnessed their journey from strangers to family. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her head. "I'm thinking about empty plates," she said, "and how sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our darkest moments." Xavier tightened his embrace. "From this day forward, I promise you'll never pray over empty plates again." Willa turned in his arms. "It was never really about the food," she said softly. "It was about having faith that tomorrow could be better than today. You didn't just fill our plates, Xavier Sullivan. You restored my belief in possibilities." As they stood together on the threshold of their shared future, the promise of rain scented the desert air once more. The drought that had brought them together was ending, just as a new season of abundance was beginning, not just in the land around them, but in their hearts as well. And in the years that followed, whenever life presented challenges, as frontier life inevitably did, Willa would remember those empty plates and the cowboy who had filled them, along with her heart. It became the foundation of their love story, a reminder that sometimes the answers to our deepest prayers arrive in ways we never could have imagined, bringing gifts more precious than we dared to request.